within quote I say, would not be sound if all men were upright. The fact that they are not colors all Machiavelli's political calculations. A prudent ruler must expect the worst from his fellow human beings and act accordingly, no matter what the moral cost. Machiavelli's greatest fear was or is that weakness or vacillation will undermine prospects of success or prospects for success in political situations that are in a state of constant flux. And this is true of every age. Overly scrupulous rulers will find that their principles are impediments to effective action. So, shifting circumstances are simply a fact of political life. It follows, this is a bare statement of political logic for Machiavelli, that rulers, I quote him, are successful if their methods match the circumstances and the unsuccessful if they do not match the circumstances. On balance, Machiavelli suggests that it is better to be impetuous than cautious. Because fortune is a woman, he compares, and if you want to control her, it is necessary to treat her well roughly. Whatever one might make of Machiavelli's metaphor, his stress on decisive action is clear. I don't sympathize with him on this statement. This appears very misogynist. But he is talking in the 16th century. Yet Machiavellian strategy cannot guarantee success, even if you follow him verbatim. He pictures a world governed by a logic of its own. Fate or fortuna is the, I quote him, is the arbiter of half our action. So, he is giving some concession to fate, divinity. But the prudent ruler still has to read situations. He should be an intelligent person, responding to the necessity when he must, grasping opportunities as they arise. For Machiavelli, this involves close reading of historical situations that will give you the necessary insight without committing inflexibly to an ideal scheme of practices or institutions. In the last resort, success is the only relevant criterion for assessing political actions. We say in normal life that nothing succeeds like success. That is Machiavellian. Success, however, is not measured simply in terms of the personal aggrandizement of a ruler, his own personal gains. In a telling example, Machiavelli focuses on the tactics of Agathocles, who rose from the status of an ordinary citizen to become the king of Syracuse. Here was a political schemer of the first order, according to Machiavelli, apparently unaffected by moral scruples of any kind. So, he was unscrupulous in that sense. He conspired with and accomplices to kill potential opponents. All he writes, Machiavelli writes, all the senators and the richest men of the city, he decimated them after calling them to a meeting. And his subsequent use of violence in conflict with the Carthaginians was similarly ruthless and effective. Agathocles' record surely should satisfy Machiavelli's criterion of political success. Yet significantly, he qualifies his judgment. It cannot be called virtue, he says. If you resort to this kind of things, it can't be called virtue, he insists. To kill one's fellow citizens, to betray one's friends, and to be treacherous, merciless, and irreligious. He's qualifying what he was telling earlier. Power may be, this is the rider he is putting in, power may be gained by acting in such ways, but not glory. Power you may gain, but not glory, not respect, not repute. Machiavelli admired Agathocles. The audacity is beyond question, but his discussion suggests clearly that instrumental violence can be justified only in appropriate cases, meaning thereby that in some cases. There is a suggestive contrast in Machiavelli's treatment of the career of Caesar Borgia. Borgia, like Agathocles, used strategic violence to further his interest Though his father, Pope Alexander VI, he was able to exploit rivalries in the Romana in order to cultivate a political domain for himself. He cleverly set faction against faction without becoming dependent on his erstwhile allies. Borgia used a merciless intermediary, Remiro de Orco, to quell the resultant disorders. The cruelty of Remiro's methods, however, had created implacable enemies. He is not directly involved. Peace had been bought at a fellow price that threatened Caesar Borgia's interest. In response, he happily presented the dismembered corpse of Remiro to the people when the time comes, effectively distancing himself from the methods that had been instrumental in creating stability and order in a persistently divided territory. He himself believed, in putting faction against faction, but when it is done by Remiro, he is distancing himself from that in order to, maintain his repute, glory. Caesar Borgia's methods look on his first, inspection every bit as reprehensible as Agathocles. Yet Machiavelli insists that he succeeded in laying I quote him, he succeeded in laying very strong foundations for his future power. His suggestion, all bad credits were given to his subordinate, and he created for himself a good, impression. So his suggestion, though he does not develop that point, is that this was much more than a personal triumph. In securing his own power and interest, Caesar Borgia had won over all the inhabitants, the citizens, for they had begun to enjoy prosperity, because at the end they became prosperous. The implication is clear. Violence used to secure appropriate public objectives is always laudable, no problem. Personal ambition might drive individuals to seek glory, and they may use the most distasteful methods in the process. A commentator, however, can draw a distinction between worthy and base goals. He himself considers as the commentator of that event. To be sure, then he says, nothing is achieved in politics without dirtying one's hands. But basic political interests trump merely personal ambition, at least in the eyes of the posterity. So the prince is addressed to a very specific dilemma, that is, how a new prince might best establish his rule. By following what kind of sets of rules? The general benefit of political order is the theme that Machiavelli handles only indirectly. Focused as he is principally on political strategy, in the Discourses, however, he has rather more to say about order as a necessary condition for human flourishing. General masses is talking about. Like the prince, the Discourses are based on a traditional literary genre. In this case, the commentary on a classic text. Machiavelli uses Livy's Great History of Rome. Livy we have already discussed as the loosest of the pretexts for development of his own political and historical theory. Commentators have always been struck by Machiavelli's declared preference for republican institutions in the Discourses, sometimes suggesting that the prince should be read as a narrowly self-interested attempt by Machiavelli to ingratiate himself with the Medicis. Then, indeed, there is no doubt from the tone of the dedicatory letter to Lorenzo de Medici that he would very much have welcomed a renewal of his active political career. It would be a mistake, however, to read too much into that dedication. The political theory of both the prince and the Discourses is plainly misread if they are set apart from one another. There is a danger of that. So Machiavelli is no less ruthless in his recommendations in the Discourses. Violence remains indispensable to political success and it should be employed decisively. What is different is the range of political circumstances in which agents find themselves. He is no longer concerned with the immediate problem of securing political order at any price. Through reflections on Levy's treatment of Roman history, he can comment on effective tactics in a variety of political contexts. The politics of Republican Rome emerges as a clear preference for him, his personal preference, though it does not follow that Republican institutions are possible or desirable in all situations. Situations might change, so this should also change accordingly. So, Machiavelli defends a contextual theory of political ethics. I deliberately say this. Defends a context, theory of political ethics. He tempers his advice to fit in the different phases in an inexorable, unavoidable cycle of political development. Like Plato, Aristotle and Polybius in antiquity, he sees the rise and fall of political orders as a determining factor in the fate and fortune of public life on any specific occasion. So, according to him, no political order will last forever. Anyone who entertains this idea should, rethink on this. Effective politics is a matter of seizing appropriate moment, adapting one's tactics to fit in that particular phase in a larger political cycle. Reading fortune's wheel is thus crucially important for political agents, politicians, rulers and others in any context whatsoever. So, forms of order come and go. Any commentator will have specific preferences, yet Machiavelli views stability in any context as a foundational political value. In a revealing passage, for example, he apparently sets his republican sympathies on one side in his praise of Sparta. When he is dealing with Sparta, he comments, I quote, Sparta observed its laws for more than 800 years without corrupting them and without any dangerous disturbance. If a political order is tyrannical or excessively authoritarian, we might regard its success as a mixed political blessing. Machiavelli, however, is emphatic. He says, happy indeed should we call that stage which produces a man so prudent that men can live securely under the laws which he prescribes without having to amend them. He contrasts this situation with the condition of a community always struggling to create stable institutions and practices. The underlying point is clear. Energy and initiative in a community are not into infinite supply. If too many people are involved in desperate measures to maintain security and order, often very frustrating one another in the process, they clearly cannot devote themselves wholesale to the very many other pursuits that distinguish a good life. Indeed, Machiavelli lays it down as a general rule that a state should be regarded as the more unhappy, the more remote it is, the more unhappy, more remote it is from, I quote, from order. So, the priority of the order is thus a dominant theme in Prince and Discourses both. The Discourses, however, add rich detail on the precise implications of that commitment. Machiavelli regards human nature as a constant in his reflections. Human nature is the constant, one constant. Yet how human beings comport themselves will vary widely in different institutional contexts. A polity that works with interventions from rulers whose wisdom cannot be guaranteed, in a striking discussion that is remarkably prescient from a modern institutional perspective, Machiavelli highlights the specifically self-correcting qualities of republican institutions, which he says that authoritarian regimes will not have that. The interest of citizens will clash in any polity whatsoever. What distinguishes republican institutions is the recourse to public procedures whenever problems and abuses arise. So, it has a standard operative procedure, SOP we call in modern sense. Disputes are managed through legal channels in the ordinary way of things. Conflict cannot be eradicated. Conflict is bound to take place, but recourse to the laws serves to stabilize and strengthen the republic. There is no need for discretionary executive intervention, which is likely to antagonize losers in a painfully personal way. Very correct. Legal processes are reinforced, and even in the face of antagonism and hostility between citizens, the legal edifice should remain untouched by these kind of considerations. Machiavelli gears his conditional defense of republican institutions to his central theme. That is the central theme of him. If the maintenance of order is a primary political responsibility of a political organization, then citizens must be aware of the many ways it is likely to be the adoption of private means for the resolutions undermined. In a republican context, confidence in public order is most likely to be threatened by disputes. Calumnies, as Machiavelli styles them, can arise in any social context, any of the social context. They are furthered by gossips, intrigue, effectively undermining trust and massively increasing the costs of cooperation. Wherever in any society, if you are preferring gossip without verification, in in Urdu or Hindi language, we say, that somebody says that the crow has taken your ear away from you. You are not bothering to check the ear, but you are pursuing the crow. That kind of thing he is saying, that you should verify this. So, he is saying that this gossip and intrigue, they effectively undermine trust and massively increase the cost at the cost of cooperation. So, cooperation will also evaporate. The weak need protectors, strong fear rivals. No one is secure. Public indictments, by contrast, make citizens aware that their personal interests are best defended through open procedures. So, disparities between the strength and wealth of citizens are mitigated in a context in which public institutions are seen as the first recourse in the pursuit of individual interest. And in an integrating aside, Machiavelli makes it clear that though his discussion is focused in this passage primarily on republican institutions ensuring order, the point holds true is in all other forms of society. So, Machiavelli steadily avoid discourse to first principles. What we find in his writings instead are maxims for the use of political agents in a variety of different contexts. Republican institutions, for example, can only flourish in a certain circumstances, which we already spoke about. Machiavelli accepts that it is impossible to maintain a republican form of government in those states which have become corrupt. It will be impossible. And if in fact one is in the unfortunate position of trying to establish government, the dilemma of confronting the new prince then would be, it would be necessary to introduce into it a form of government akin rather to a monarchy rather than to a democracy. A strong ruler can do that. Machiavelli's defense of republicanism is purely instrumental. At its best, in the right circumstances, it can manage the passions and ambitions of men as well as any other political form. But once, regard for public culture and institutions have been lost, however, other methods will have to be adopted. These will be contingent methods. The tone of Machiavelli's writing is both dispassionate and urgent. There is an urgency. Public order is treated as fragile, achievement on which all else depends. Public order is very important according to him, and in an emergency, every other consideration must be set aside in order to maintain that public order. Machiavelli asserts categorically, I quote, that one's country should be defended whether it entail ignominy or glory, whatever may be the cost, at any cost. As ever with Machiavelli, care must be taken with his language he is using. The Prince and Discourses are both, focused on necessarily tactical means of political success in different contexts. But success is not measured in personal terms. Rulers and active citizens are urged to sacrifice their self-interest for the common good if need arises. When the safety of one's country is at stake or wholly depends on the decision to be taken, no attention should be paid either to justice or injustice. Now, very pragmatic suggestion is given to kindness or cruelty, to its being praiseworthy or ignominious, you just take a right decision. By right within quote, he means the appropriate decision at the time to save the country from these kind of things. Therefore, Machiavelli's advice is unconditional. Everything that an individual holds praiseworthy or holds dear might have to be subordinated to the demands of a political crisis, meaning thereby that you should put aside your personal orientations, personal piety, personal morality, personal other things, go ahead whatever is needed for the country as such. Political crisis. Every other consideration, he says, should be set aside, he insists, in order to save the life and preserve the freedom of one's country. So, the narrowness of Machiavelli's focus is evident in this passage. Let us have a critical approach. As in the passages noted earlier from the Prince, which I profusely quoted, he inverts a conventional scale of values in order to make a dramatic tactical point. But what does he have to say to readers who may simply not accept the priority he attributes to political values? There might be some people. He gives us ample construct and argument, but readers find themselves filling out positions that are sometimes left frustratingly incomplete. The final chapter of the Prince is a perfect illustration of an attentive reader's dilemma. Tactical analysis gives place to a passionate exhortation to anyone who dares to liberate Italy from the barbarian yoke. A natural reading suggests that this is a plea for political self-determination along lines that later became fashionable in the great nation-building movements. In future, you will find it of the 19th century, despite the fact that the idea of a nation barely existed in early 16th century discourse. In rudimentary form it was, at the very least, however, it is clear that the question of why we should value political order needs to be treated rather differently from the means we might use to maintain it. Machiavelli raises an issue that he cannot effectively address in his own terms, not least because he has such little faith in conventional styles. I give full credit to him for this, of philosophical justification, and according to him was a breath of fresh air even to readers who were scandalized by his contempt for conventional political morality. He is against that. He threw down a challenge to political theory that remains arresting to this day. to our present times. His obsession with the instrumental use of power, however, left many questions unanswered. He has very little to say about precisely how political order should be justified to parties that may simply feel that power is being wielded at their expense. States are coercive instruments and coercion hurts. Coercion can also be exercised in support of good or bad ends in more or less appropriate context he is always emphasizing. Machiavelli's preoccupation with the instrumental political violence is ill-equipped to deal with such issues. Yet, justification in wider terms became manifestly necessary as states were consolidated in the early modern period. They were consolidating, they were coalescing and consolidating. So, orthodox defenses of rule in the period invoked a curious mix of Thomist natural law theory and Neoplatonism, often in Bowdlerized form. Kings claimed to be God's lieutenants on earth. We also had a king who claimed that he is the shadow of God on earth, occupying a distinctive place in the great chain of being that justified both the immense power that they assumed and their awesome responsibilities. Any inversion of this natural order would invite chaos, directly threatening not only the state as a political entity, but the ordinary certainties of social and family life. So, sensitivity about the fragility of political order was strengthened, was emphasized, was heightened by the threat of civil war. In France, for example, the consolidated monarchical rule was exposed to challenge from both the sizable Protestant minority and the doctrinaire Catholics who sought to use the state as a direct means of enforcing religious orthodoxy. Both positions assumed without question that political order should be justified in specifically religious terms. In this scheme of things, a monarch's position in a political hierarchy might have to satisfy a direct and more or less detailed religious test. And in a context of acute religious controversy, the state itself would be rendered vulnerable to shifting currents in the religious culture. So, with whom to align and why to align? That is his question. So, thus we find Machiavelli is giving us some of the thoughts which were to become in subsequent centuries some of the guiding principles of state. That is why we have included him in his in our course, and in order to to understand how in the historical methodology the practical side has been taken into account by him in both the books, The Prince and the Discourses, and then his there are many examples. I have given only 2-3 examples to you, but you can multiply these examples. The texts are full of such examples. So at the back of it, what we find is that his dismissal and subsequent alienation from the ruling polity was actually was a crucial factor for him to think in these terms. These are in the form of advices. Like we have discussed Ziauddin Barni. His text is also, he is saying that my objective is to give advice to others, so that the nobility and the rulers, the ibrat, he is talking about that. That was happening in the 14th century India. This gentleman is going beyond that. So, in the entire political apparatus, what could be the guiding principles and how far one should go without compromising the basics, that is the unity and the intactness of the nation. For this, everything is justifiable. So, that kind of argument was inconceivable in the Greco-Roman Empire. We have never heard of any such, any person saying these kind of things. So with this, I conclude. Thank you very much.